in France, in Vichy France and the Empire. I particularly would like to thank the director of the Maison Française, Shani Peer, because she gave me the opportunity to bring this conference to the Maison. And I would also like to thank Robert Paxton for being le doyen du projet. And I would also love to thank all of the participants, all of the speakers, because you were so incredibly cooperative and hardworking and enthusiastic, and it made my job so pleasurable, and I am so grateful. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I think the full term is doyen d'âge, isn't it? But Harry did a great job whipping everyone into line and gathering a very distinguished group of people. I hope you've noticed that we have pretty much the leading figures in every part of this field to speak. And that's certainly true this morning. Renée Poznanski, who's going to speak in a moment, is a great power in this field. When she writes and speaks, everybody listens. She's the Yaacov and Poria Avnon Professor of Holocaust Studies at Gurion University in Yeshiva. She also teaches a lot in France and lectures often in the United States. She's incredibly productive. Her CV lists 53 chapters and articles. I will not enumerate them. Among her books, I'd like to single out two that show how she tackles a big subject and creates an indispensable work out of it. One of them is Jews in France during World War II, published in France in 1997, and it's now in English since 2001. The French word for these works is incontournable, which is exactly English equivalent, indispensable. The other work I want to mention is her most recent book, published in 2008, called Propagande et Persécution, La Résistance et le Problème Juif, and she tackled the extremely sensitive and delicate subject of how Free France and the resistance responded to Vichy's anti-Jewish program, and the answer is with reticence. And she doesn't just assert that, she's counted it. She's looked at every utterance, every publication, she's quantified it. And what they said was impeccable, but they didn't say it very often, because they thought it wasn't necessarily the way to the heart of the population of France. It's an extraordinary book. I hope it's coming out in English. Well, any publishers in this room, step forward. Her subject this morning is resistance and the rescue of Jews in France from history to historiography.
Thank you very much. It's really a big honor and a great pleasure to be here on you. Thank you for the kind words, Bob, and thank you for to be here. A conference on Jewish rescue in France and the Empire during World War II. At first sight, the trailblazing nature of such a project leaps out at you. It seems obvious. Historians of the Second World War in France, and especially those who have studied the fate of the Jews in France, with very few exceptions, among them very many among us, have tended to neglect the overseas possessions. I too plead guilty in this respect. Our historical analysis has rarely gone beyond the borders of continental France. But this conference is a watershed for another reason. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but except for a conference on the resistance to genocide organized by Jacques Semelin, Claire Andrieux, and Sarah Gainsbourger at Sciences Po in 2005, which relied on a comparative approach, this is the first conference at a major university to deal with the rescue of the Jews in France. If one thinks of the centrality that memory of the Shoah has acquired in the Western world, that seems somewhat astonishing. We must search for the root causes of this eclipse in the history of the period itself, a history that was reproduced in historiography until the urgent demands of memory finally reshuffled the deck. Let me quote Jacques stages of the persecution, deportation, and extermination of the Jews, wrote Semlin in his introduction to the collected proceedings of the conference mentioned above, studies devoted to rescue efforts are quite rare. Bob Moore, in a volume published in 2010, holds in one feature of this historiographical lacuna. He writes, discussions of national resistance to Nazism often marginalize the help given to Jews, and likewise, texts of the fate of Jews and the incident of rescue have few reflections on the wider context of resistance. As a matter of logic, the story of the rescue of the Jews of France ought to be based on the history of the resistance. In practice, it's clear that resistance is the only label that can be applied to helping Jews who were threatened with arrest and deportation to the east. But this common sense observation was not self-evident under the occupation and the Vichy regime. The rescue of the Jews was marginalized twice over. Let's go back to the early summer of 1940. On June 22, after its shocking defeat by the German armies, France accepted the terms of an armistice that dismantled the country and paved the way for the end of the Third Republic. The eastern province, Alsace and Moselle, were torn away. The Germans occupied the capital as well as the northern part of the country. A new order, the French state, replaced the republic that was now charged with responsibility for the disaster. The Germans applied decree after decree in Paris and throughout the occupied zone, and Maréchal Pétain and his government in Vichy retained sovereignty over less than half of French territory, the so-called Free Zone, while its measures adopted as part of the National Revolution applied throughout the country. This aimed to put France back on its feet and restore its status in the new Europe that was being built in the shadow of the Third Reich, with which the new regime collaborated actively. Whatever happened, the flame of French resistance must not and shall not die, declared General de Gaulle over the BBC on June the 1940, in reaction to Pétain's first speech accepting the defeat. Summoning the French people to keep on fighting, de Gaulle specified its objective: delivering the fatherland and remaining in the camp of the ultimate victors in this war, which was or would be soon a world war. Going beyond the diverse motivations and goals of those who made their way to London or joined a resistance group on French soil, the frame established by de Gaulle's first speeches imposed a particular reading of events. The resistance was born of a political decision whose translation on the ground was both political and military. We might think to take only one example of the invention of resistance by those who later became the Musée de l'Homme Group. This involved meetings to discuss the latest broadcast from London, an initial tract, posters on the walls of Paris, and then a newspaper, Résistance, which first appeared in December 1940. From the outset, resisting meant making another voice heard and applying every means to denounce collaboration with the Germans. Speech was at the center. The extraordinary growth of a diversified underground press in both zones is evidence of this. As the months passed, the proliferation of networks and movements, the links to London, and the emergence of a coordinated political force that would be ready when the time came to take part in the liberation of France and then to assume political power, reinforced these two dimensions, the political and military, of a patriotic resistance. To return to the Musée de l'Homme group, its members soon discovered another urgent need, helping prisoners of war escape and smuggling them to southern zone outside the Germans' reach. According to Germaine Tillon, and I'm quoting her, the escape section remained the main activity throughout 1940 and 41. Here, resistance involved action rather than words, originating in the individual initiatives, but supported by legal institutions too. And I'm quoting Tillon again, convents and parish houses that became places of refuge, and even some official agencies that were part of the state bureaucracy. These were the same mechanisms that would later play a role in the rescue rescue of the Jews. But those helped to escape French soldiers and British airmen were incompetent and clearly part of the war. It was natural for the networks being formed to concentrate on them. Rescue for rescue's sake, with the focus on civilians, had no place there. This marginalization of the rescue of civilians within the political alternative that gradually emerged was accompanied by a marginalization of the fate of the persecuted Jews. Although they were not the only victim of the occupation, Jews became quickly a priority target. Nevertheless, the Resistance press never gave the Jews the attention it lavished on the people of Alsace and Moselle, annexed to Germany or expelled from their homes, or to the Poles suffering another German jackboots. The Jews of the occupied zone found themselves victimized by a dual anti-Semitic legislation, German and French. As soon as September 14, the Germans ordered a census of all Jews and had the French police stamp their identity papers. 3 weeks later, the Vichy government issued the Jewish statute and transformed the Jews into second-class citizens overnight. At the same time, the Pétain government abrogated the Crémieux Decree of 1870. Algerian Jews lost their French nationality, citizenship. It authorized prefects to intern foreign Jews in a special camp by administrative order. This edict made it possible to send 40,000 foreign Jews to camps in the southern zone and served as the legal basis for the roundups which led in the Paris region to the internment of some 8,000 Jews in 1941 alone. The Vichy government also seized Jewish property, whose plunder was ordered by the German occupation authorities in pursuit of their policy of Aryanization of the economy. In June 1941, Xavier Vallat, the first commissioner for Jewish questions, completed the anti-Semitic legislation with a new Jewish statute. We are not talking about an ill-assorted collection of occasional texts. Their number, several dozen laws, decrees, and ordinances, is evidence of a firm resolution. The sum total of these laws expressed the policy upheld publicly in officials' communiqués, as well as in commentaries in the national and local press. This sharp and total violation of one of the fundamental principles of the French Republic was not a marginal element of the new policy that ruled the country. Assorted diaries provide evidence of the impact these anti-Semitic laws had on what people were talking about. Raymond Aron, in the analysis he published in London in La France Libre, commented them, as did Pierre Tissier in a book he published in London in 1942. Nevertheless, the persecution of the Jews was mentioned only sporadically in the infantry underground press, and even then in terms that were often quite ambiguous. Rare were those outlets that denounced persecution in clear terms. In the short list of exceptions, the most remarkable of all would be the Cahier du Témoignage Chrétien, we heard about it yesterday, which in its introduction to a special issue entitled Antisemitism, leveled a harsh indictment of the silence that had settled on the persecution of the Jews. But Témoignage Chrétien was a minority voice. No other underground publication followed its lead. One reason for this discretion, not to mention silence and indifference, was the veneration that much of the population felt for Maréchal Pétain, about that we heard yesterday as well. It can be associated with the ambiguity that marked the early stage of most of the underground movements, which imagined themselves as completing what the Marshal was trying to do, though he was compelled to feign obedience to the occupier. It could also be explained by the aggressive propaganda that blamed the Jews for the defeat and accused the resistance leaders of being in their pay. It was based on the conviction, widespread in public opinion and deeply rooted among some members of the resistance itself, that the Jews posed a problem, that Français tout so. Hence, it was inappropriate to denounce too strongly measures that addressed this problem, perceived as real, even if they were excessive or being applied at a bad time. Ostracism and theft were simple preliminaries. From the spring of 1942, the application of the final solution to the Jews of France became the order of the day. The appearance of the yellow store in the streets of Paris and throughout the occupied zone at the beginning of June 1942 clearly indicated the change. Arrest followed by deportation to a terrifying terrifying unknown destination became the most pressing threat, which weighed on the entire Jewish population, first of the occupied zone and then of the whole country until liberation. On July 16 and 17 of 42 and following days, more than 13,000 Jews, including more than 4,000 children, were arrested in Paris by the French police as part of a vast operation that came to be known as the Veldiv roundup. A final journey in sealed freight cars carried these unfortunate families via Nancy, children included, to Auschwitz. In early August, the Jews of the southern zone faced the same threat. On August 31, 1942, a memo by National Police Headquarters reported that more 11,184 Jews had been apprehended since the start of the month and deported. Between the end of March and the end of September 42, more than 38,000 Jews were deported from France in 41 convoys, all leading to Auschwitz, heading to Auschwitz. It was during this month that the underground press finally woke up. Most resistance publications sounded a loud cry of horror. The same themes poured from every editor's pen. German barbarity was showing its true face on French soil. The Jews were the first victim, the prelude to measures that sooner or later would strike the entire population of France. Children were being ripped from their mothers' arms, and the French were indignant, appalled, in full sympathy with the victims, and especially the innocent children. The indignation was sincere, no doubt, but it was expressed exclusively in humanitarian terms and had no impact whatsoever on the goal or practice of the resistance movements. The mass arrests conducted by the French police continued in waves in both zones until February of 44. There were also the constant arrest of individuals, an activity in which after November 42, the German police, aided by auxiliary forces drawn from collaborationist groups, were increasingly involved. These arrests continued until the liberation of the entire country, while the circle of potential victims kept expanding. All told, almost 76,000 Jews were deported from France, of whom only 3% survived. But after the indignation of the summer of 42, the resistance press resumed its silence about the fate of the Jews. One looks in vain for the slightest reference to what awaited the Jews deported from France, except for Témoignages Chrétiens again, even though reports were filtering in, circulated by the Jewish Communist Press or broadcast of the BBC, to which more and more people were listening despite the prohibition on doing so. The resistance had other priorities. Nobody wanted to alienate the masses who had been affected by anti-Semitic propaganda, and who, as all opinion surveys confirmed, combined their true compassion for the fate of Jewish children, victims of Nazi barbarism, with a fear that an Allied victory would bring back the Jewish problem. The immediate goals were to keep young Frenchmen and women from being transported to Germany as forced laborers in the STO, Service du Travail Obligatoire, and to make preparation for the liberation of French soil. So, the persecution was not covered by the resistance press. The mass roundups of Jews and their deportation hardly ever gained its attention except for 4 short months. How could the rescue of these same Jews find a spot on the list of the resistance activities? The welfare organizations, Jewish and non-Jewish, we heard of the CIMAD yesterday, nevertheless had been the first to go into action, even ahead of the resistance, devoting themselves to various groups threatened by the impending persecution. The American Emergency Rescue Committee, again we heard about, directed by WWII, did everything it could to facilitate the immigration of the most exposed intellectuals. He opened an office in Marseille as soon as August 1914 and helped hundreds to escape France. Social workers from various institutions, Jewish and non-Jewish, worked in the internment camps to alleviate the detainees' suffering. There were also activists, notably those of the OSE, who set to work as early as the summer of 40, and by May 42 had managed to free almost all of the children from the internment camps in the southern zones. In Paris, and of political groups such as the Bund and Socialist Zionists, who have decided to coordinate their activities. From the beginning, they operated on a dual track. Even though their work was not clandestine, the committee did not register with the authorities. Soon, however, the mass arrest of Jews, the opening of the internment camps, and then the deportations transformed the group's mission. It helped Jews sneak across the demarcation line to the southern zone and got involved in the production of false papers. Under the cover of the Red Cross, it sent packages to the camps, it farmed out children in peril to Aryan families, and it distributed clandestine aid to those who could not approach the legal organizations. Most of what these organizations did at first was perfectly legal, but the idea of cooperating to ward off and counter the threat was certainly there. The OSE was not the only organization that focused on the clandestine rescue of children, whether by hiding them with Christian families or by smuggling them across the border to Switzerland or Spain. In the southern zone, there was also the CZM, an outgrowth of the Jewish schools, which coordinated its underground activity with those of the Zionist youth movement. These groups paid the price for this. Marianne Cohn and Mila Racine were the most famous victims, but there were others as well. The evolution of the OSE from legal welfare work responding progressively to the Jews' growing misery to resistance work focused on rescue is symbolic of the gradual transformation experienced by many Jewish and non-Jewish welfare and educational organizations. The transition can be precisely located in the impact of the mass roundups of the summer of '42, which also spurred individual initiatives such as those of Moussa and Odette Abadi, who set up the Marcel Network in Nice. In all of these cases, what were called social activity led to a transformation in the attitude towards politics of some charitable groups that accommodated themselves to the existing political structures as long as they could continue to carry out their mission. All those involved were aware of the defiance represented by any act of solidarity with the persecuted. Howard Brooks, a pastor affiliated with the Unitarian Service Committee, who arrived in France in the spring of '41, referred to those expressions of solidarity as the first signs of passive resistance. For several months, he shared the life and work of these activists, whom he evoked in lines he set down when he returned to the US in January of 1942, and I'm quoting him. The spineless apathy everywhere evident during my first weeks in France was depressing. Apparently, the only real effort to thwart the Nazis was being made by foreign organizations, which were able to operate in very limited fields: immigration, restricted feeding, and amelioration of various kinds. Brooks was thinking in particular of the Emergency Rescue Committee, but also the Quakers, of the YMCA. The latest representative in France, Donald Lowry, referring to the rescue by Amitié Chrétienne of 90 Jewish children during the summer of '42, roundups, and to the assistance extended to the Jews by the residents of Chambon-sur-Lignon, wrote in a report composed in September '42 that, and I'm quoting Lowry, aimed to anti-Jews involves resistance to the authorities in Vichy. So the political significance of rescuing Jews was thus clearly perceived, as it was by the Jewish activists. But this story developed in parallel with and in the margin of history of the capital H, the political and military history of the Resistance. In May '42, one could read the following lines in the Cahier du Témoignage Chrétien, and I'm quoting. Here we would like to set aside a special place for this admirable and most relevant form of assistance to the Resistance, providing shelter to all the homeless, all the hunted, all of those proscribed persons whose number the occupation has multiplied, ranging from the patriots pursued by the Gestapo to the Jews whom the swastika has turned into an outlaw. The right of asylum has become a duty of asylum. In these sentences, Cahier du Témoignage Chrétien once again set itself apart from every other underground publication. This notice didn't escape the attention of the MOI, the Organization of Immigrant Jewish Communists in the MOI. Starting in the summer of '42, its underground publication had rained constant appeal on the French people, in which the monstrous fate awaiting the Jews deported to the East was described in agonizing detail. They implored French families to help rescue Jews, and especially children. Now, this publication wasted no time in reprinting these lines from Témoignages chrétiens. Why this haste? Because they could facilitate a transition from the expression of humanitarian feeling to a political practice, which had been inconceivable before the enactment of STO in February of 1943. J'accuse, one of these underground Jewish communist publications, had tried to trigger this shift at that time. And I'm quoting J'accuse. Can we stand aside and be indifferent to the depopulation of our country, to all of the young people who are threatened with deportation? Jewish children are particularly in danger. You see, the Jewish workers, French workers, Jewish children. Saving one of these children is not only a human act, but also patriotic. Yet, the political meaning of the rescue of Jewish children described as a patriotic act was difficult to convey. As late as July '42, Fraternité and Droit et Liberté, two other underground publications run by the Jewish communists, referred, this time directly, explicitly, and repeatedly to the stand taken by Témoignages chrétiens. But this attempt to integrate the rescue of Jews into the resistance movement as a whole was in vain. For the underground groups of the French resistance that were working towards the liberation of the country, as well as for the Free French, the fight after the deportation of French workers was a political combat. Any support for acts of solidarity for the persecuted Jews was a humanitarian matter. On the eve of the liberation, the French administration in Algiers approached about 6 Jewish children rescued from France by the World Jewish Congress, expressed its gratitude to this organization for its humanitarian action. The rescue of the Jews was organized on one planet, while the resistance operated on another. The resistance habitus had its own code and values, while the rescue habitus had others. The Jewish resistance organization, grouped in a committee of general defense, were well aware of this. In their application to join the Conseil National de la Résistance, the organizations focused on the unique nature of their activities, and I'm quoting the letter they said. Your resistance actions and ours were not born at the same time and were not initially of the same nature. The law condemned us to being robbed without any remedy, and for most of us to destitution without remedy. So our first form of resistance was mutual assistance, but it was a form of resistance, stated the letter. This had been followed by a second form of resistance, that of escape and defense. And the text continued, this brought us closer to you. But this attempt was in vain. The obstacle continued to block the full and complete publicly recognized incorporation of the rescue of Jews into the resistance movement. The first, which can be traced back to the sources of the social imaginary, l'imaginaire social, had to do with the fear of stirring the old demon of the Jewish problem by referring to the specific fate awaiting the Jews. The second was inseparable from the meaning attached to the resistance ever since its inception, which focused on political opposition to Vichy and on the liberation of France, and did not include rescue for rescue's sake. In Algiers, on January the 6th, 1943, General de Gaulle signed an ordinance whose first clause legitimized, and I'm quoting the ordinance, all acts committed out after June the 10th, 1940, with the goal of serving the cause of the liberation of France, even if they were criminal under the legislation in force in that period. A general amnesty for those who had used false papers to protect themselves during the war was declared in January 1945. It was based on this ordinance. How could those Jews who, facing persecution during the occupation, had forged or used false identity cards to escape the Gestapo or Vichy police demonstrate that they had done so in order to liberate France, to help liberate France. Rescue has no intrinsic value. The persecution of the Jews was not perceived in its collective meaning. The double marginalization survived liberation. Well, one might imagine that the transition from living history to writing history, which demands a critical and analytic process, would move away from what history itself has turned into a consensus. But inasmuch as the same causes produce the same effects, the rescue of Jews only made an appearance in post-war history. Witnesses from all sides immediately took the field and, to borrow an expression coined by Henri Rousseau, made their cacophonous voices heard. Among them, the foremost resistance fighters were particularly sensitive to how their story would be told. Of course, the historians quickly set to work. As early as October 1944, a commission on the history of the occupation and liberation of France was established under the auspices of the Ministry of National Education. It focused on the history of the resistance. The first stage consisted of finding and collecting documents, supplementing by interviewing witnesses. The resistance is first of all a patriotic fight for the liberation of the fatherland. I'm quoting Henri Michel in 1960. A year earlier, 1959, the Committee for the History of the Second World War, established in 1951, had launched the preparation of a chronology of the resistance. What should it contain, wondered Henri Michel in the committee's bulletin. And I'm quoting Henri Michel. First of all, clearly the actions: sabotage, ambushes, parachute drops, landings, operation by the Maquis, the battles of the liberation. Second, the repression by the occupier must be noted. It either disorganized or punished the efforts by the resistance. Third, place must be left for the collective movement, demonstrations, strikes. Finally, one must not forget the bureaucracy of the resistance, with the creation of departments, appointments, and changes of functionaries. End of quote. Assembling archives is not a neutral act. It is conditioned by the definition of the field to be documented. In turn, it conditions the analytic framework that guides the historians who use these archives, and also for many years. Material was collected as a function of the supreme objective that resistance set to itself. The patriotic battle to liberate the fatherland. It is thus oddly astonishing that nothing in the chronology being drawn up, mentioned, or even touched on the rescue efforts of the organization that worked to save Jews. When the Committee for the History of the Second World War was collecting archival documents and testimonies, the Center for Contemporary Jewish Documentation, the CDJC, located on the very same street, was doing much the same thing. Relations between the two groups were excellent, indeed perhaps too close, because when the committee turned up a document that might interest the Jews, it just sent it off to the CDJC. This creation of two different archives gave rise to two parallel historiographical enterprises, which moved ahead without ever coming into contact. One group focused on the chronicles of France, the other on the annals of the Jews. In 1949, the CDJC had published 19 studies, but the dominant zeitgeist imposed its own rules, especially because the Jews of France had first of all to consolidate their status in the new France that was emerging under the auspices of a particular vision of the resistance. Two of the first CDJC studies, both of them published in 1947, dealt with the Jewish resistance. Jacques Lazarus' Juif au combat, and David Knud's contribution à l'histoire de la résistance juive en France. Both Lazarus and Knud were first-hand witnesses, but the former offered his own testimony, whereas the second presented more of an overview. Both were Zionists, which did not keep them from integrating the Jew struggle into the dominant rhetoric. The heroism of Jewish combatants occupied center stage. One of the aspects of the budding historiography produced by the CDJC was indeed to include the Jews in the glorification of the mythical resistance that was dominant at that time. The centrality of the political and military character of the resistance in the CDJC's earliest publication memory of the Organisation Juive de Combat, the Zionist group, to which both Kuhn and Lazarus had belonged. But it also promoted the narrative of the Jewish communists in the internal Jewish political arena. The latter had created a rich and diverse underground press, both in English and in French, and had been famous for spectacular armed action. On the French public scene in those years, the Communist Party was doing its best to appropriate to itself the actions accomplished by its Jewish wing and suppress the fact that those who had carried them out were foreigners and often Jews. An anthology of pieces from the underground Jewish communist press was published in 1950 under the title La presse antiraciste sous l'occupation hitlérienne. The general term anti-racist press conveyed a message that was acceptable to the public at large, while the publication itself served the political needs of the Jewish communists within the community. In perfect phase with the dominant notions, David Diamant published his tribute to the Jewish heroes of the French Resistance, which was the title of his book, in 1962. By positioning themselves in the forefront of the Jewish resistance and thus as heroes of the French Resistance, the communists scored points in the internal Jewish debate. Thus, everything conspired to marginalize rescue. It was also in 1947 that the CDJC published a book on the activity of the Jewish organization in France under the occupation. In order, and I'm quoting Yitzhak Schneerson, founder and president of the CDJC, to acquaint readers with the passive resistance, mute but relentless, put up by the Jewish organization and charities. This attempt was modest. In the face of the communist attack on this organization, and given the atmosphere at the time, this topic did not enjoy the prestige attached to armed resistance. So the rescue of Jews had to sneak into the CDJC historiography. The image of the Jews in French society was at the heart of these activists' preoccupation, but they were not equipped to challenge the dominant representation of the resistance. The studies produced by the CDJC were intended only for a handful of subscribers, and no historians ever made reference to them. The centrist periodical Le Monde Juif published the research that had been carried out, reproducing archival documents. But none of this was ever incorporated within French historiography. True, the history of the resistance at large was shunted from the sidelines by the scholarly world as too close in time. Eventually, however, it acquired full rights in academia, starting in the mid-60s and even more so after the establishment of the Institut d'Histoire du Temps Présent in 1978. This was a fait accompli. Nevertheless, when it was decided in 1964 to include studies and articles about the period 1939-1945 in the Bibliographie annuelle de l'Histoire de France, annual bibliography of the history of France, Le Monde Juif was left out. Thus, the continuation of the situation of the war years relegated the story of the rescue of Jews to the margins of historical writing. But the blossoming of Holocaust memory in the Western world, along with the appearance of new trends in historiography, brought some change to this situation. On two occasions, before what came to be known as the Pakistani Revolution of the early 70s, the genocide of European Jewry made a brief appearance in the French public discourse, in debates that spilled over from the Jewish press and pointed the public spotlight on the unique nature of the Holocaust, following the publication by André Schwarzbach's The Last of the Just, which won the Prix Goncourt in 1959, and after the publication of Jean-François Schreiner's Treblinka in 1966. The authors of these two bestsellers set the extermination of the Jews at the center of their works, which, however, dealt more with the Jewish response to the Holocaust than with the Holocaust itself. It was this Jewish response that provoked fierce public debate among both Jews and non-Jews, who reflected on the Jews' non-violent reaction. This kind of debate reinforced the accents of what had been written since right after the war. The Jews had fought back, they had not allowed themselves to be led like lambs to slaughter. Jewish communists and Zionists of the Jewish Combat Organization were once again honored in Jewish France. but this was only the prehistory of a radical change in the perception of the unique nature of the Shoah in the Western world as a whole, as in France in particular. This change was also linked to the historiography of France during what the French refer to as the Black Years. Thanks to Robert Paxton, the Vichy regime came to occupy the center of a historical revision that reinserted the war years into the chain of French history and the social history of that era. Vichy stopped being an accident, the product of the machinations of a handful of conspirators, the link between the National Revolution that Pétain sought and implemented and the decision to collaborate with Nazi Germany, the autonomy of Vichy's anti-Semitic policy and its participation in the implementation of the final solution in France, these were no longer taboo. With a certain lag after Vichy, the historiography of the French resistance also took a new turn. Critical inquiry replaced apology, the picture painted by a new generation of historians was richer, more complex, more nuanced. Political history gave way to social history. The study of resistance by women gained in legitimacy, and the spotlight shifted from the leaders to the rank and file. At the same time, the notion of the civilian resistance was promoted by Jacques Semelin and linked to the study of the peripheral circle that had supported or simply approved of the resistance fighters. The sociologist had come aboard. Attracted more to theoretical analysis and untouched by the schemes bequeathed by the witnesses and the archive that had assembled, they urged historians to define before they describe and analyze. In parallel to these developments, the context within which the history of the rescue of the Jews could be written and developed was agitated chiefly by the issues of memory and commemoration. While Robert Paxton incorporated the anti-Semitic policies of the Jewish regime into his dual study of the National Revolution and the policy of collaboration, Marcel Ophuls, The Sorrow and the Pity, highlighted similar themes in his portrait of Clermont-Ferrand under the occupation. The unique character of the Shoah was emerging. The changes in French Jewish demography, starting with the arrival of the refugees from North Africa in the early 60s, followed by the fallout of the Six-Day War, awoke Jewish memory. And this, according to Henri Rousseau, is one reason for the new centrality of the Shoah in the debates that were always in the news, starting in the early 80s in what he called the obsessional phase of the Vichy syndrome. I will not review the flip-flops of memory that eventually led to Jacques Chirac's acknowledgements of France's guilt in the persecution of the Jews on its territory. But in the speech he delivered on July 16, 1995, at ceremonies to mark the roundups of July 42, there was another time. He said the following, President Chirac, and I'm quoting him: "There is also France, a certain idea of France, one that is just, generous, faithful to its traditions and its spirit. This France was never at Vichy. It no longer was, and for a long time, in Paris. It was in the sense of Libya and every place that free French people fought. It was in London, embodied by General de Gaulle. It was present, one and indivisible, in the heart of those French people, those righteous among the nations, who, when the storm was darkest, risked their life to save, as Serge Marspel has written, 3/4 of the Jewish community living in France, thereby giving life to all that is best in France, to the human values, to the values of liberty, justice, and tolerance that are the foundation of the French identity and that of the Yaacov for the future." A new figure, end quote. A new figure had just made its appearance in the memorial landscape of the Second World War. The righteous among the nations, who became the righteous of France, as Sarah Gainsbourg has demonstrated in the study on which I'm drawing here. 3/4 of the Jewish population of France owed him or her their lives. The celebration of the righteous of France continued and even gathered speed in subsequent years. They even made their solemn entry into the Panthéon on January 18, 2007. The honor of France was cleansed. The Vichy's regime guilt in the deportation of the Jews to the camps was balanced by the efforts of tens of thousands of citizens, those righteous of France. Suddenly, we saw, and I'm quoting Sarah Gainsbourg again, we saw the partial substitution of the figure of the righteous for that of the resistance fighter. The implications of this redistribution of roles appear most clearly in a series of films broadcast in France starting on February the 18th, 2008. That day and the next, primetime viewers of the main public network, France 2, were treated to two 90-minute fictionalized documentaries on the French resistance. The first was titled Live Free or Die. The second, We Have to Save the Jews. Starting 4 days later on a less popular network and at an off-hour 52-minute films took up the same topics in great detail. What thread ran through this television event, which was almost 8 hours long? There was a switch from a resistance that was understood as political and military resistance to the German occupation of the country, to the notion of a spirit of resistance, shared by the entire French people, which found its natural culmination in resistance to the Shoah of the Jews in France. The behavior of those French people who sheltered Jews or refrained from informing on fugitive Jews was now paradigmatic of the spirit of the entire resistance. In this social environment portrayed so favorably, the rescue operation that had been organized and financed by Jewish organizations, assisted by some charitable French non-Jewish associations, became the focal point of the portrait of a society resisting the oppressor. In blatant disregard of the historical truth, all of French society, under the aegis of a resistance that was totally in phase with the spirit that moved it, is pictured as having mobilized to save the Jews of France. The rescue of Jews, which slipped into resistance studies by the back door, has come to occupy half the room, which it now shares with the political and military resistance. These films were widely endorsed by many eminent historians, with the notable exception of Jean-Luc Rémy-Briac and Henri Rousseau. There were no protests against this idyllic picture of the resistance or its role in the rescue of the Jews. Now that the Jews had found a place in French historiography, there was more attention to the rescue of Jews by Jewish organizations, but it remained an internal Jewish concern relevant to the definition of the Jewish resistance. As a reaction to the previous reaction, some proposed that the true meaning of Jewish resistance was to be found in the organizations of rescue efforts, resistance to the Shoah that should be distinguished from the French resistance. This excluded the Jewish communists from the Jewish resistance in France because they had pursued goals set by the party. The Jewish social organization and the Zionists now monopolized the symbolic space of Jewish resistance. Lucien Lazare is a representative of this school. In his book, La Résistance juive en France, retitled in the English translation to make his thesis more obvious, Rescue as Resistance, How the Jewish Organizations Fought the Holocaust in France, following the same thread, he went on to publish Le Livre des Justes about non-Jews who had saved Jews. The two stories remain distinct. A Jewish resistance different in its nature on the one hand, and rescue efforts that included the activities of non-Jews on the other hand. Both stories bore the strong imprint of ideology. The former proposed a limited definition of specifically Jewish resistance, limited to rescue efforts. The second echoed the commemoration of the righteous of France and focused on the role of individuals. Terms like Jewish resistance, rescue of Jews, righteous person, rescuers, individual organized actions, all were marked by a vagueness that served ideological objectives or echoed memory issues. But the rescue enterprise still occupied a negligible and poorly defined role in the history of the resistance. In a typological essay on the resistance written in 1986, Derrida had described the aid given to the victims of oppression and persecution as humanitarian resistance. The rescue of the Jews naturally fell into this category. This amounted to making historiographical use of analytical patterns borrowed from the war period without the slightest critical attention to its implication and connotation. particularly as regards the contour of rescue. In practice, by focusing on the rescuers' motives and the results of the persecution, the humanitarian perspective transformed the victims into a passive object of history that was no longer their own, while marginalizing the cooperation between Jews and non-Jews in organizing rescue operations. Indeed, imposing such a sharp division between rescuers and victims leads to two different stories. Or perhaps we should say three stories. That of the French resistance, that of the rescue of the Jews by non-Jews, and that of the Jewish resistance. The fact remains that even under its humanitarian label, the rescue resistance has not really penetrated the sharp mental boundaries of the true resistance. Let me offer by way of conclusion one example. In the Historical Dictionary of the Resistance, published in 2006, the author of the entry on WWII felt obliged to justify his inclusion in the work, and I'm quoting. If the name of WWII merits appearing among the Resistance members, it is because his activities, legal and illegal, illustrate a stage in the consolidation of the Resistance which made it possible for his comrades who remained in France, such as Jean Gemaling, to move on to another stage of action. End of quote. Not only is it felt necessary to justify Price's inclusion in the dictionary, it is also emphasized that rescue efforts were only an initial stage that led those involved to become full-fledged resistance fighters. Let me propose an alternative to this sentence, one that would, in my opinion, support a historical study of the rescue of the Jews. It would run like this. And I'm quoting myself. From the very beginning of the occupation, the trailblazing efforts of WWII represent one of the earliest stages in the consolidation of a resistance in France, the one that devoted itself to rescue operation. This form of resistance developed further when the persecution of the Jews reached its height, thanks to the combined activities of various social groups and Jewish organizations, supported by many individual initiatives. The organized movements of the resistance played only a marginal role in this enterprise, for this is indeed the crux of the divorce between resistance and rescue that continues to mark contemporary historiography in France. Another approach would not diminish the merits of the heroic resistance in the slightest, but it would require consideration of its weaknesses too. The history of the rescue of the Jews in France cannot be studied in isolation. It must be part of an integrated perspective that leads to thinking about the resistance as a whole, organized and unorganized, Jewish and non-Jewish. Thank you.
Is there someone who wishes